Hello, welcome everyone. It's Phil Cain here. Hopefully everybody can hear and see me, both from Club Soda group and from the future. Welcome everyone. Thanks to Laura and Jen for having me on. It's a great privilege to have this opportunity. I was going to start with just a quick overview of what I've done in my book, which I'll just quickly show you. It's called Alcohol Companion. I'll just give you a quick overview of the book, and then maybe we can come back to some questions later. I think Laura is on hand to kind of dish up some questions later on. So, my first thing possibly is just to introduce myself. I'm a journalist who worked, most recently in the Balkans, covering former Yugoslavia and the countries in the surrounding region. And before that, I worked writing about science and technology, also in business and society. And weirdly, that kind of fusion works in terms of the subject of alcohol, in that obviously science and technology, it's a scientific subject, it's also a business subject. Obviously, alcohol has a commercial aspect to it. Yeah, so I'm a mixture of political and scientific and business correspondence, which I think is quite a reasonable mix for this subject, in that it's a mixture of these topics, and particularly the Balkan experience is quite useful in giving me a kind of insight into a subject which is not clear cut, and there is no getting around the fact that this is not a subject where you're not going to get simple and clear answers. There is a kind of a messiness to it, and fundamentally we're talking, although the subject is alcohol, we're actually ultimately talking about people, and people as affected by a substance which acts on their brains. All of these things we don't really understand properly, so we've got to sort of set our sights reasonably realistically to begin with. But nevertheless, there are still some generalizations that you can make. Even in the reporting about the Balkans, you can still know more about the Balkans than other people. You can still say things which are more relevant and more useful to the people of the Balkans and those trying to understand it. And the same is true of alcohol. And so what I've tried to do with the book is to present a kind of account which is hopefully an account which can be used not necessarily as a kind of prescriptive guide. It's not my my advice about how to deal with your relationship with alcohol, but provide some information which can help you make your own choices. So I've made the comparison between a kind of sat nav, and a sat nav doesn't tell you about where A and B is. It tells you how to get from A to B, and it's the same with this book, really. I'm not trying to say what relationship you might have with alcohol now and where you're trying to get to. It could be more or less anything. Although I guess in this group, most people are trying to have a more kind of managed relationship with alcohol, but this is not the case with all of my readers. But the whole, if you add it all up together, it's adds up to quite a big rethink, because if you're like me, I would have basically not known anything about alcohol when I started. I was like most people. I had what I knew from friends, family, what I read in the newspaper, and really not a lot else. So it's a big rethink, and it's not an easy thing to do. I think often, particularly since I published the book, I sometimes get criticised for sitting here trying to sort of confirm my opinions. And I think actually, at least during the process of writing the book, I spent a lot of time actually wrestling with my opinions and actually trying to get them to fit the facts, because I was basically wrong, and being wrong is quite painful. And that's basically that's a kind of caveat I'd say at the beginning, is that the book doesn't necessarily make it easy, but it makes it as easy as I could make it. But in the end, the reward is, I hope, a kind of a foundation of some of the science of the subject, some of the sociology of the subject, some of the kind of common misconceptions. And it means that whatever you want to do, you have a kind of solid foundation. I think there's a story about having a house built on rock rather than on sand. So I'm trying to provide some rock, and you build a house. So that maybe going too far with that particular metaphor, but basically just to get into actually a little bit more of the content of the book itself. The first aspect of it is, or the sort of historical aspect, which I'm sure people have done in more detail and more nuanced detail than I have, but is the key point, I think, for people who are trying to look at it as a subject to do with their health and well-being, is the fact for the most human history, we've actually seen it as a medicine. It's been something which somehow we thought was going to make us better, or make life better, and it was prescribed to people by doctors, by philosophers, back to the Greek times, and no doubt before people were writing things down. And this carried on basically almost to the present day. I mean, at least until the Second World War, there were doctors prescribing alcohol to people for various conditions, and still now you'll still see occasional news stories about health benefits which are allegedly associated with it, which are basically not true, or at least not something we should use as a preventative medicine. It's simply not prescribed by any doctor, and never should be, and we shouldn't do it for ourselves. It's one of those things that I was saying is not easy to accept, because it basically, drinking alcohol feels good, and we think something that feels good should do us good, but it's not always the case. And this is certainly the case with alcohol. Excuse me a sec. So but the good, sort of positive outcome of that is that it's not a bad thing to be denied something which is merely comforting. I mean, it's a bad thing to deny yourself something which you think in the back of your mind might be good for you in some way, either emotionally or to do with your internal health. But to deny yourself something which just feels nice is like denying yourself a kind of something of no utility. It's not something you should mourn. So it's a painful realization, but one which ultimately gives you a kind of freer relationship with alcohol. The next topic, having dealt with kind of all of human history, is to get onto the neuroscience of alcohol. It's essentially, ultimately, we are talking about a substance which affects our brains. It's a psychoactive drug. And we take alcohol, or we obtain alcohol in order largely to satisfy our brains. So understanding the brain is helpful in understanding our relationship with alcohol. The bottle doesn't get its way from the off license or from the barman or whatever onto our table, into our mouths, without our brain telling us to do so. So, ultimately neuroscience has some contribution to understanding why we do that. And one, I mean, this is a whole chapter. This is a very much a potted version of it. But one of the mechanisms at work is the reward mechanism. One of the, it's often reported in the newspapers as a pleasure-seeking way of, we go out. It's almost like those fools going out to try and jump on a roller coaster over and over again, and not realizing it's a bad idea. But actually, if you look at the scientific literature, the dopamine responses, which is what they're talking about, is actually not a euphoric response. It gives a substance significance. So we think that, in words, crudely speaking, it means that something feels important to us, rather than necessarily sort of a rush of pleasure. So it feels like it's the right thing to do, which perhaps explains why in some instances we might find ourselves in a pub or drinking situation, and sitting behind a pint that we kind of think, why did I order that? This doesn't make any sense. I didn't want that pint, and yet I have it. And you drink it and you think, these situations I think are fairly common, and maybe more common for some than others. And I think actually what we're doing in that instance is misinterpreting the situation, in that we did want that pint, we wanted it, but we wanted it without liking it, and the two things are actually different. The pleasure and the significance and the desire to have something, the wanting, are two different sensations, and understanding that difference, I think, can help us understand ourselves and understand our sometimes frustrated desire to drink. Maybe some other aspect to it is the idea that alcohol is a social lubricant, or it gives us a kind of, the Dutch courage that we talk about. Social lubricant always seems a bit of a strange way to look at it. But anyway, I think maybe we could look at the fact that essentially the reason it gives us this ability to perform, for a small audience or whatever of our friends, is the fact not that we are any more courageous than we were before, but basically we are unaware of, or less aware of the effect we're having. We're a little more blinkered in our thinking. So, courage, again, the phrase, picking holes in that phrase, but we shouldn't think of it as courage, but more of a kind of willful ignorance of a situation, which allows us to behave in a less encumbered way. So it's just a small thing, but it may make us not mourn the loss of that capacity, because essentially it's not quite what we think it is. Talking of groups, there's another part of that social side of alcohol, which is quite a big challenge. I think I've seen quite often in the club soda discussions, people sort of wrestling with this difficulty, which is essentially that we are tribal or group. We operate as groups, as a species. We join together to, I suppose in the old days, kind of hunt animals and form a safe unit. And we basically are still the same human beings as we were 10 millions of years ago. And we feel desperately unhappy when we are thrown out of our gang, thrown out of our tribe. And, although the alcohol is one of the things which help us to create these temporary shifting kind of alliances, which I've called, in this kind of homage to George Orwell, group drink. And I kind of try and separate that from alcohol as a psychoactive, because I think it's actually quite a different aspect. I don't think we talked about the social lubricant aspects of alcohol, but I think it's actually much simpler than that. I think if, like me, you've turned up at a conference late, or somebody's messed up at the reception desk, and you've not got not been given a conference badge, you will be, people will say, "Who is this guy who's showed up? He's, hanging around the conference without a badge on," and you'll be treated as a bit of a kind of misfit and ne'er-do-well, basically, until somebody maybe scrawls you a badge, you put one on, and so all of a sudden you're part of the in crowd, and it shows, it's a very sort of simplistic way of showing just how small signals and signs show, that we belong or don't belong, or what our intentions are towards a group of people. And this is an emotional process. It's not necessarily rational. But on both sides of that equation, there are feelings. It's a two-way process, and we have to find a way around it, or deal with, rejection or feelings of rejection either way. And alcohol, I've got an example. If I walk up to a group with, this is alcohol-free, by the way, but if I walk to a group with a beer, I'll get a far different response than if I walk up to a group with a glass of water. People will think, who is this guy? And it's really, both of them have the same chemical effect on me. One is, in this case, alcohol-free, but it's the signal that I'm giving off is significant to that interaction. So I've written elsewhere that alcohol has provided a kind of Facebook for our interactions in the past, and we've kind of used it in a very similar way, in that it kind of allows us to kind of, it gives us an excuse to barge into a situation that we possibly couldn't otherwise if we were abiding by all the rules. And in that respect, it's a positive thing. I'm not a kind of hermit or anything. But it also throws up these issues like Facebook about, belonging or not belonging, being their friend officially or not, or being in a group or not being in a group. And this is quite a difficult thing to deal with, particularly if you're, on that borderline. I think, Club Soda is doing extremely valuable work in trying to sort of blur that border, because that is actually, you know, the difficulty that a lot of people have shifting their behavior in order to, you know, improve their lives. Yeah, some people find it easier than others. I would say that I'm probably more of the kind of some people can be sort of bold and the leader, and, you know, they're quite happy to stand out from the crowd, whereas others, like myself, are quite happy, you know, maybe happier just sort of being a little bit more in the background, and not necessarily, you know, making statements about their own behaviour, sort of a public, item for public discussion. So this is this thing called stealth drinking, which occasionally pops up in the media, which I basically go along with that, although I would probably call it stealth not drinking, but that's me being pedantic. Yeah, an alcohol-free drink, as I've just shown, is a, you know, good way round this issue, and in that you can essentially kind of bluff your way through an evening, and really it's not and dabble in not drinking or drinking less or whatever your goal happens to be, without sort of raising eyebrows and causing a sort of discussion about a topic which, you know, though I find it terribly interesting, is not necessarily what everyone wants to talk about on a night out. And, you know, my personal view is that what you have, you know, ultimately the position we would like, I think we should aim for, is that, you know, really what is in your glass is your business. It's not anybody else's business. If you have alcohol in it, fine. If you don't have alcohol in it, fine. And that way everybody's happy. It certainly shouldn't be, you know, something that people kind of interrogate you about and ask you why or why not you have something to drink. I personally would just say, well, you know, it's beer, you know, and not necessarily have to commit to one thing or another. Anyway, that's my personal take on it. But as I say, it rather depends on who you are and what you're trying to achieve. Yeah, but also, you know, the other side of that is that a lot of the experiments have shown that drinking a drink that, well, people drinking a drink that they think is alcohol-free will actually promote behavior, you know, of having an alcoholic drink. You know. So we can kind of fool ourselves, particularly if we're sort of people who are used to behaving a certain way in a certain drinking situation and are happy to sort of reproduce that. Then, you know, alcohol-free beer kind of gives us that placebo effect, makes us more pro-social, as they say, and you know, as I say, doesn't create this sort of barrier between you and your old pals. But as I say, I know that some people find it problematic, but I think that potentially for some people it can be quite helpful. Yeah, we're going back to yeah, so the sort of elephant in the room, I think, or the iceberg, I think I wrote about it once, is, I think the rather more darker subject is the effects that alcohol has on our mental health. Yeah, I think shortly after I published the book, I got an email from a Greek psychotherapist who said something he get for every 5, I think he said, yeah, for every 5 patients he has, you know, 2 will have primarily a drink problem, and 2 will have a problem which, you know, he believes is clearly connected to their drinking. And you know, the statistics, if you look at them, are pretty clear that there's, you know, a lot of truth to that, not just in Greece and not just in this guy's surgery. So yeah, I think the statistic I just pulled out for this was that a quarter of alcohol-dependent people, I won't go into that, but a quarter of all alcohol-dependent people, which in the old terminology would be sort of alcoholic, suffered depression in the last year. I mean, that's just an enormous number, and if you sort of include anxiety and all these sometimes quite difficult to define terms, you're talking a huge contribution to the burden of mental health, which I know is just statistics, but you know, I think as individuals we can act on, you know, these generalities and see that maybe we are part of this pattern. Yeah, those are the extreme end of the spectrum. I personally believe that a lot of these cases, you know, cases further down the line where we probably wouldn't bother our doctor with, you know, feeling a bit down or feeling a bit tense or whatever it happens to be. You know, I think I've no reason to believe that alcohol doesn't contribute to them either. It doesn't get picked up on the statistics because, you know, you don't get diagnosed with feeling a bit down. You get diagnosed with something more serious than that. But yeah, I think ultimately, I think the message to take from that really is, if you have anxiety or you have, feelings of depression, essentially feeling down, then, stopping drinking is a good first step. It's the number of people who find some relief in not drinking or cutting down their drinking to a very sort of minimal level is extremely significant, and there's absolutely no reason not to give it a try. So, but in doing that, I think you have to realize that, depending, again, I'm trying to, provide advice for people who have obviously very different kind of experiences, but 3 to 12 months is a reasonable time frame to start seeing basic improvements in that respect. An evening out of your emotional stability or instability, and people who have done 12 months still report feeling significantly better after that. So yeah, I mean, my sort of an analogy of that is that you can see this as kind of repairing a vehicle, repair your car, and then once you've repaired your car, then you can go somewhere. It does take a while. I think that's the reality is you just have to stick it out for, like I say, 3 to 12 months is a realistic time frame to really sort of nail it in terms of, but then you can really go places, and you really can start to explore the possibilities of life without some of these sort of niggling mental health problems. Yeah, so it brings me, this is the final bit I'll talk about, which is the kind of the point of it all. And I mean that in the kind of most general sense, which is what we are actually trying to achieve in our lives, which I think for the most part, and this is not to prescribe to anyone, but I think most people are trying to achieve some form of happiness in their life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and all that. And just understanding what actually that means, or what people who say they have happiness actually say it is. I mean, it's all very well talking to people who feel unhappy, but they can't tell you about happiness. They just can tell you that they don't have happiness. So by talking to people who are happy, or chronically happy, as they actually say, it's kind of a bit of a joke, maybe. It's not a euphoric experience. They don't walk around sort of big sort of emoticon grins on their faces. They're actually in a complex state of happiness, sadness. I always tend to think it was probably a Shakespearean thing about a weave of emotions, a complex weave of emotions. And I mean, it's the complexity suggests, at least to me, from what I've read, is that it's about a functioning brain. It's about having your brain work in a complex and reliable way. And alcohol is, or limiting alcohol can make a big contribution to achieving that. And ultimately, exploring this topic is about exploring being human. And this is a very difficult journey. I'm not going to make any suggestions otherwise, but it's one which can have a very positive outcome. And I mean, at least for me, it was a big task, 4 years in the making, but ultimately, it is actually a privilege and honor to have done it. So I hope I can share some of that with you now, and I hope the book actually conveys some of that, maybe in more detail.